All right, consequentialism. Right. So, consequentialism stands in direct opposition to deontology. Right? If we can break down moral actions into three parts, it would be intention, action, consequence, right, or result. So, for deontology, all that matters to determining the rightness or wrongness of an action is going to be the action itself, right? The consequences do not matter, just the action does, right? Just the action. And intent only matters insofar as determining whether or not someone is praiseworthy for doing the right thing. Right? It has nothing to do with whether or not the right thing is the right thing. Consequentialism, by comparison, is going to say that we look at looking at actions in isolation from their consequences is stupid and wrong, right? What matters ultimately is going to be the consequences. The actions are only we're only concerned ourselves with the actions insofar as we can parse out the consequences, because it's the consequences that ultimately matter, right? And so consequentialism, when taken to its logical extreme, right, um, it kind of embodies the phrase "when taken to its logical extreme." Right? Used in a reasonable sense, it's not nearly so bad. It's actually fairly commonplace. We do this all the time with cost-benefit analysis when we're trying to decide on a course of action. The cost and benefits are weighed, often in terms of the consequences that bear out from our choices. So, the logical extreme of taken to its logical extreme, consequentialism is pretty well defined, or can be pretty well defined. Some of its pitfalls, at least, can be pretty well defined by the phrase, "the road to hell is paved with good intentions." Right? The intentions behind choosing one action in consequentialism is that it will lead to better consequences overall, right? But that can allow for one to do truly despicable things to get to that end result. Right? Um, it's a case of, in Kant's terms, it would be a case of treating other people merely as means rather than as ends in themselves. Now, the ancient foundations for consequentialism are found in hedonism, right? Which was one of the ancient Greek schools of thought, um, sort of contemporary with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and whatnot. Right? So there were four major schools of thought, like general schools of thought, outside of those major philosophical figures that make up Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. There was hedonism, right? Which says that the good life is the life of pleasure. Stoicism, which says that the good life is one is one found in apathy, right? Where apathy leads to happiness, right? It's being stoic. Um, there was skepticism, which said we can't really conclude what the good life is, so just live your best life, basically, since we can't have actual knowledge of anything. Um, and then there were the virtue ethicists that kind of rose out from Aristotle. These were known as, I hate this word, hold on, the Pediapalex. That basically translates to the walkers, right? The idea was that you go out, you walk, and you think, and you talk, and you discuss. Like, philosophy in the good life was a life that was engaged with the world. Right? It wasn't one that was stationary like the Stoics or just consumed in pleasure. It was active. Right? Hence, the term translating to the walkers. Right? So ancient ethics was concerned with morality by looking at but concerned with it in sort of a different way than we tend to be today, right? In ancient Greece, the concern with morality was what way of living leads to living a good life. Because living a good life, part of that meant living a just life, living a moral life in the ancient Greeks' minds. And so different theories focused on how to live a good life in different ways, and there were metaphysical assumptions and also ethical assumptions built into what the good life was. We've already seen that with Aristotle. We see something similar um, Pla with Plato and Kant as well. For the hedonists, the good life is the life of pleasure, right? And this makes sense because it's derived from the Greek word hedonia, which means pleasure. And it was founded, hedonism was founded by the philosopher Epicurus. Right? Epicurus being, which is why, those who revel in the finer things in life are called Epicureans, right? They're not just hedonists, they're high class hedonists. So hedonism, consequently, is more a way, is a more psychologically motivated view than like the other normative ones. It's closer to Hume's moral theory in a certain respect than it is to Kant's or Aristotle's. Right? As Epicurus said, right, the idea behind hedonism is that the rule for motivation, the basic motivating factor for what we choose to do is the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, which really just comes down to pursuing pleasure. Right? So this is what motivates our choices and actions, but there is, according to Epicurus, a hierarchy of pleasures, right? Ones that are more pure and less contrived, I suppose, less artificial, more pure and more enduring. So as he said, we recognize pleasure as the first good in us, right? Inside of us, right? And from pleasure we begin every act of choice, and to pleasure we return again. Pleasure is the motivation and the source of how we make all of our choices, right? Even if you want to talk about, well, I want to avoid consequences X by choosing this action. Yeah, it's, you're still operating under pleasure. The avoidance of pain is a passive way of seeking out pleasure. So, for the hedonists, there are 10 categories of pleasure that form up 5 pairs, right? And we'll go through them in sort of descending order of pairs. Right? First, there are the higher pleasures. Right? These are lasting, always good, and relate to personal growth or development of the mind or self. Right? So things like learning, philosophy, friendship, these are all spiritual or mental in nature. Right? They're nurturing of the self. And for this reason, they're higher pleasures. They're ones that you can return to time and time again and receive the exact same satisfaction. Right? And contrasted with this, we have the lower pleasures. Right? These are going to be intense, brief, and body-based. Things like sex, and food, and sleep, right? And drinking. Right? Now, we combine, now this is the highest outgrowth of a system. Think of the hedonist system as sort of the hedonistic view of pleasures is something similar to like a reverse pyramid, an upside down triangle, basically, right? Where the lower we go, the closer we get to a more general origin point for everything, and then everything grows out of that. Okay. So this is going to be the largest section, two sections, the higher pleasures and the lower pleasures. Well, what are they made of? Well, they rest on the distinction between the natural pleasures and the unnatural pleasures. The natural pleasures are going to be pleasures that are there in nature or that we naturally seek out. Things like food, drinking, sex, friendship, right? And learning, right? They're going to be things that we naturally do anyway. And then the unnatural pleasures, by comparison, are going to be pleasures that are artificial or man-made, right? Things like Netflix, Spotify, the rodeo, right? Rock climbing. Even though that's there in nature, doing it for fun is definitely an insane human thing. Hi, I'm an insane human. Okay, then we have the distinction between the necessary and the unnecessary pleasures. Right? Uh, right? The necessary pleasures are going to be the ones that we need for survival in life. Food, sleep, right? We don't need sex for our own individual survival. Maybe as a species we do, but sex is actually an unnecessary pleasure, right? We don't need sex to survive. Uh, So things like sex, your stupid bug collection, my stupid rock climbing, my grandpa's stupid. Wait, no, he's dead. My grandma's stupid. Wait, no, she's dead. Um, well, when they were alive, their stupid cooking utensil obsessions and stamp collection. Right? Those are unnecessary pleasures. And then we have the distinction between present pleasures and future pleasures, right? The pleasant pleasure is the only present pleasure is the only one that's guaranteed, right? So we usually seek out immediate gratification. And there's nothing exactly wrong with this as long as it's done in a measured and sensible way, right? As long as it's essentially looking at satisfying the immediate, necessary, natural, higher pleasures, then you're on the right track according to the hedonists. All right. So the present pleasures are pleasures that are immediately available to us. Right? And these are generally preferable because we can act on them right now. There's also the fact that the future is not so guaranteed. Right? And meanwhile, future pleasures are those that we must work towards, right? And cannot presently act upon because of, some limiting factor, either distance, money, time, what have you. Um, and as a result, the future pleasures are generally lower on the scale, right? Um, Lower down in value than the present ones. Since there's no guarantee that we can that we'll ever actually get to them. If you're thinking of something like higher and more complex, like vacationing in Hawaii, right? For a lot of people, that just remains a dream throughout their life. Uh, don't do it, or if you do, don't stick to just Oahu. Like, go to a small bed and breakfast on one of the other islands. Just Oahu is a tourist trap. I lived there for 5.5, 6 years. It's a tourist trap. Um, all the good things that are actually worth doing are worth exploring the island for, not just staying in Waikiki, if you do ever go there. Okay, so all this combined leads to the idea of the ultimate pleasure, right? Which hedonists say is the way we ought to live life, what we ought to aim toward. And really quick, let me make the division, right? Higher pleasures better than lower pleasures. Natural pleasures are better than unnatural pleasures. necessary pleasures are better than unnecessary pleasures, and present pleasures are better than future pleasures, generally speaking. And then active pleasures, forgot that category, which is just the psychological motivation to seek pleasure itself, is better than passive pleasure, which is avoiding pain, right? Which is something we naturally do as a part of pursuing pleasure, which is why it's a passive thing, right? The only time in which we actively avoid pain on a conscious level is when there's an immediate threat to our safety, right? Or an immediate choice that makes it aware, like it's clear that we won't derive pleasure from it. So, we scale kind of in ascending order these pleasures, right? So the lowest of the low in terms of pleasures are going to be those that are unnatural and unnecessary because they're going to be entirely consumed amongst the lower pleasures. Those are lower pleasures in their entirety. And then we have the natural and unnecessary, which are going to be still lower pleasures, but they're going to be a step up, right? We've trimmed away the fat, the unnecessary pleasures, right? Or sorry, the unnatural pleasures. Um, and modern day interpretations of hedonism, we can actually debate what's unnecessary and what's necessary, or unnatural and natural, right? Is I'd argue that rock climbing is a fairly natural pleasure, but that's me, right? And then we have the necessary and the natural pleasures, right? Those pleasures that are both necessary and natural are going to be the highest of the high amongst the lower pleasures, right? The ones that we seek to satisfy only as they occur to us, such as, or that we should seek to satisfy only as they occur to us, such as food, eating, sleeping, uh, and whatnot. And they're going to also be composed primarily of the higher pleasures, those that enrich the spirit and the mind. So this hierarchy is important to consider when thinking about the pursuit of the ultimate pleasure, right? Which is the absence of pain and gentle relaxation of the mind attained by scaling down the unnecessary and unnatural desires and stimulating the mind. Right? So hedonism, this whole edifice here, makes up the ancient foundations for consequentialism.